The moment the sleeve of her scrubs rode up and the ink on her forearm caught the fluorescent light, the entire nurse's station went silent, and then it didn't. Someone laughed. Someone else whispered the word, "trashy," just loud enough to be heard, and Nurse Callahan felt her face burn the way it always did, though she had long since trained herself not to let it show. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in people who carry more strength than the world ever gives them credit for, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, share this with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Midnight Tales so you never miss a story like this one. Her name was Mara Callahan, and she had worked the night shift at Riverside General for 6 years. She was good at her job, the kind of good that came from doing everything twice as carefully because she had once done something wrong enough to haunt her for the rest of her life. The tattoo on her forearm was small, faded at the edges, a simple trident wrapped in a length of rope with a single date inked beneath it. She never explained it to anyone. Not to the other nurses who speculated she'd gotten drunk on some island vacation, not to the young residents who assumed it meant something rebellious about her 20s, not even to her supervisor, who once suggested she consider a long-sleeve undershirt so patients wouldn't get the wrong impression. Mara let them believe whatever story was easiest for them to swallow. The truth was heavier than gossip, and she had learned that grief shared with the wrong audience only turned into ammunition. So she kept her head down, did double shifts nobody else wanted, and treated every patient who came through those doors with a gentleness that seemed almost out of place in a woman the other staff had quietly nicknamed the Tattooed One, always with a little curl of judgment in their voice. It was a Tuesday night in early November when the ambulance bay doors burst open and a gurney came rushing through with a man in his 50s, gray at the temples, blood soaking through a field dressing wrapped hastily around his side. He had collapsed at a veterans' charity dinner across town, an old shrapnel wound reopening after decades of scar tissue finally giving way, and the paramedics were shouting vitals that made 2 junior nurses freeze in the hallway. Mara didn't freeze. She had trained for chaos long before she ever wore scrubs, though nobody in that hospital knew what that training had actually looked like. She moved into position beside the trauma bed with a calm that seemed almost unnatural, cutting away fabric, calling out numbers, her hands steady even as machines began to scream their warnings. The attending physician later said that if she had hesitated even 10 seconds, the man might not have made it to surgery. But Mara didn't think about heroics in the moment. She thought about pressure and airway and the simple, stubborn refusal to let another person die in front of her if she had any say in it. The man survived the surgery, and 3 days later, when he was finally strong enough to sit up in his hospital bed, his family filled the room, but it was the visitor who arrived alone, dressed in a plain gray jacket with posture like a steel beam, who changed everything. He introduced himself simply as a friend from the man's old unit, though the way the other nurses straightened when he walked past suggested he was far more than that. He had the weathered, quiet intensity of someone who had spent a life in rooms where mistakes cost lives, and when he stepped into the hallway to thank the staff, his eyes moved from name tag to name tag until they landed on Mara's exposed forearm. He stopped walking. He stared at the trident wrapped in rope, and then at the date beneath it, and something in his expression cracked open, the professional composure sliding away to reveal something rawer underneath. He asked her, quietly, where she had gotten that tattoo, and for the first time in 6 years, Mara didn't deflect. She told him it belonged to her brother. She told him his name, and the date on her arm, and the unit he had served with, and as she spoke, the man's jaw tightened, and his eyes grew glassy in a way that made the nurses gathered nearby stop pretending not to listen. He told her that he had commanded that unit. He told her that he had written the letter that arrived at her family's door all those years ago, the one that started with words no family should ever have to read, and that he had carried the weight of every name on that letter every single day since, including hers, though he had never known she existed until this exact moment. The hallway went utterly still. Then, without a word of explanation to the confused staff around him, the SEAL commander drew himself up to his full height, squared his shoulders, and raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute, the kind reserved for those who had earned it in blood and sacrifice, and he held it there, looking directly into Mara's eyes, until she understood that this gesture was not for her brother alone. It was for her, for the woman who had spent years quietly carrying his memory in her skin and in the way she fought for every patient like they were the one person she hadn't been able to save. The nurses who had mocked her tattoo, who had rolled their eyes and made their little comments in the break room, stood frozen in that corridor, watching a decorated commander salute a woman they had dismissed as nothing more than someone with poor taste in body art. Word spread through the hospital faster than any gossip ever had, but this time it carried something different, something like shame mixed with awe, and by the following week, nobody whispered about Mara's tattoo anymore. Instead, people asked her about it gently, respectfully, wanting to understand the story behind the ink rather than judge it. The commander returned twice more before his friend was discharged, and each time, he sought Mara out, not out of obligation but because something in that hallway had shifted something in him too. He told her that meeting her had given him a kind of peace he hadn't felt in years, a sense that the ripple of loss he carried had found its way into someone strong enough to turn grief into purpose. Mara, in turn, finally allowed herself to grieve out loud, in small pieces, to someone who understood exactly the shape of what she had lost. If this story touched your heart even a little, if it reminded you that the people we judge too quickly often carry stories we could never imagine, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Your support means more than you know, and it helps stories like Mara's reach the people who need them most. Before we go, we have a special request. In the comments below, we'd love for you to write the words, "I see you," as a small tribute to anyone in your own life who has quietly carried a burden the world never noticed, the way Mara carried hers. Months later, Mara still works the night shift at Riverside General, but something about her has changed, or perhaps something about the people around her has finally caught up to who she always was. She no longer covers her forearm, no longer flinches when someone's eyes drift toward the trident and the rope and the date that once invited only whispers. Now, when patients ask about it, she tells them the truth, simply and without shame, that it belongs to her brother, a man who gave everything so that others could come home, and that wearing his memory on her skin is the closest she can come to making sure he is never forgotten. And somewhere, in barracks and briefing rooms far from that hospital, a commander who once raised his hand in salute still thinks of the night he found a piece of his fallen soldier living on in the steady hands and unbreakable heart of a nurse the world had almost failed to see.